The candles on the long dinner table burned low, and the silver cutlery caught the light like small blades. Eleanor Vance sat with her back straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap, the way she had been taught since she was a child. Across from her, Duke Alaric Ashworth cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the quiet room like a crack of ice on a frozen lake. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady but careful, "I am to wed your dearest friend." The words hung in the air. A servant near the wall paused mid-step, then continued, as though nothing had happened. The fire in the hearth crackled. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not gasp. She simply reached forward, picked up the small silver dish beside her plate, and said, "Pass the salt." Alaric blinked. He had expected many things from this moment. Tears, perhaps. Anger. A sharp word. Even a slap across his face, delivered by a woman who had every right to feel betrayed. What he had not expected was this calm, this unbothered stillness, as if he had simply commented on the weather. "Did you hear me?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "I heard you," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "You are to marry Margaret. I think that is wonderful news. Now, the salt, if you would be so kind." He passed it to her, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. She did not pull away, nor did she linger. She took the dish, sprinkled a pinch over her plate, and continued eating, as though the conversation had already ended. But inside, a storm was gathering. Eleanor had known Alaric since she was 12 years old, when her father, a minor merchant with grand ambitions, had secured an introduction to the Ashworth family through a business deal that nearly ruined them both. She remembered the first time she saw him, a boy of 14 with serious eyes and an awkward smile, standing beside his father in a garden full of roses. He had offered her a single flower, red and slightly wilted from the heat, and she had laughed at how solemn he looked while doing it. That was 15 years ago. 15 years of letters exchanged in secret, of quiet conversations in libraries while the rest of the household slept, of a friendship that had grown into something neither of them dared name. She had told herself, over and over, that what she felt for him was simple loyalty, simple affection between old friends. She had told herself this so many times that she had almost believed it. Almost. Margaret Whitfield was Eleanor's closest friend, the daughter of a respected family, with land in the north, and a reputation for kindness that stretched across 3 counties. Margaret had a laugh that filled rooms, and a heart that seemed incapable of holding a grudge. She and Eleanor had grown up 2 streets apart, sharing tutors, sharing secrets, sharing every small joy and sorrow of childhood. When Eleanor's mother had passed, it was Margaret who sat with her through the night, holding her hand and saying nothing, because sometimes nothing was exactly what was needed. And now Margaret was to marry Alaric. Eleanor set down her fork with deliberate care. Across the table, her younger brother, Edmund, glanced at her, with concern written plainly on his face. He was the only one at the table who seemed to sense that something beneath the surface had shifted, that the calm exterior his sister wore was a mask stretched thin over something far more turbulent. "When is the wedding to take place?" Eleanor asked, her tone light, almost conversational. "In the spring," Alaric answered. "Her family wishes for a proper season of preparation." "How lovely," Eleanor said. "Margaret has always wanted a spring wedding. She used to speak of it when we were girls, how she wanted flowers in her hair and sunlight on her face. I am glad she will finally have it." Alaric studied her carefully, searching her face for any crack in the composure she presented. He found none. It unsettled him more than tears would have. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind a dozen times on the carriage ride over, imagining her anger, her hurt, even preparing himself to comfort her if she wept. He had not prepared himself for this cool, polished indifference. Because he knew Eleanor. He knew her better than anyone, save perhaps Margaret herself, and he knew that this calm was not real. It could not be real, not after everything between them. The dinner continued in strained pleasantries. Eleanor's father spoke of trade routes and taxes, oblivious to the tension crackling beneath the surface of the room. Edmund tried twice to change the subject, mentioning a horse race he had attended the week before, but the conversation always drifted back, inevitably, to the wedding, to Margaret, to the future that Alaric had chosen. When the meal finally ended, Eleanor rose from her chair with the same grace she had carried all evening. She thanked the Duke for joining them, wished him well with his engagement, and excused herself to retire early, claiming a headache that had been building all day. It was not entirely a lie. She walked up the stairs to her chamber with slow, measured steps, each one a small act of control. She passed the portraits of her ancestors lining the hallway, their painted eyes seeming to watch her with quiet judgment. She reached her door, opened it, stepped inside, and closed it firmly behind her. Only then did the mask begin to slip. She pressed her back against the door and slid down until she was sitting on the cold floor, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. Her hands trembled, the same hands that had so calmly passed the salt only minutes before. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry, because crying would mean admitting that this hurt, and admitting that it hurt would mean admitting things she had spent years refusing to admit even to herself. She had loved him, she loved him still, and he was going to marry her best friend. The unfairness of it struck her like a physical blow. Not because Margaret did not deserve happiness, for Margaret deserved every good thing the world had to offer, but because Eleanor had spent years believing, quietly, secretly, that perhaps one day Alaric would look at her the way he looked at no one else, and finally say the words she had been waiting to hear. She had believed it during the long conversations in the library, during the letters filled with careful affection, during the moments when his hand had lingered on hers just a little too long to be simple friendship. She had been wrong. Downstairs, Alaric sat alone in the drawing room, a glass of untouched wine in his hand. He stared into the fire, his thoughts a tangled mess he could not seem to sort through. He had told himself, for months now, that his engagement to Margaret was a matter of duty, of necessity, of family obligation that could not be avoided. He had told himself that his feelings for Eleanor were a foolish indulgence of youth, something he needed to set aside for the good of his family, his estate, his future. He had told himself many things, but watching her tonight, watching the way she had so effortlessly composed herself, so effortlessly hidden whatever storm might be raging beneath, he felt a familiar ache settle in his chest. It was the same ache he had felt for years whenever he was near her, an ache he had never quite been able to name, or perhaps had simply refused to name, because naming it would have made it real. He thought of the roses in his family garden, of the first flower he had ever given her, and wondered, not for the first time, whether he had made the greatest mistake of his life. Upstairs, Eleanor finally rose from the floor. She walked to her window and looked out at the dark garden below, the same garden where she and Alaric had spent countless afternoons as children, running through hedges and inventing games with rules only the two of them understood. She thought of Margaret, of her bright laugh and her kind heart, and felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her grief. How could she resent her dearest friend for finding happiness? How could she wish for anything less than joy for the person who had stood by her through every hardship of her life? And yet, beneath the guilt, the ache remained, sharp and persistent, refusing to be reasoned away. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would wake and put the mask back on. She would smile at Margaret, offer her congratulations, help plan the wedding if asked, and never let anyone know the truth of what lived inside her heart. She had spent years perfecting the art of composure, and she would not let it fail her now, not when it mattered most. But even as she made this vow to herself, a small, quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered a question she could not silence. What if Alaric felt the same ache she did? What if, beneath his own careful composure, there existed a similar storm, a similar grief, a similar longing for something he had convinced himself he could never have? She did not have an answer, not yet. The house grew quiet as the night deepened. Servants extinguished candles one by one, until only the moonlight illuminated the halls. Eleanor changed into her nightgown and lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. Downstairs, Alaric eventually rose from his chair by the fire, set down his untouched wine, and made his way to the guest chamber prepared for him, his mind still churning with thoughts he could not quiet. Neither of them slept well that night. In the morning, the household stirred with its usual routines. Servants prepared breakfast, horses were groomed in the stables, and the sun rose over the estate, as though nothing unusual had happened the evening before. But something had shifted, subtle and invisible to most, yet undeniable to the two people at the center of it. Eleanor descended the stairs for breakfast, her composure fully restored, her hair neatly arranged, her expression pleasant and unreadable. She greeted her father and brother warmly, inquired about their plans for the day, and ate her breakfast with the same practiced grace she had displayed at dinner the night before. Alaric joined them briefly, before departing for his own estate, offering polite farewells and a promise to send word regarding the wedding preparations. When he approached Eleanor to say goodbye, their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that moment, something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. A flicker of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of everything neither of them dared to say aloud. Then it was gone, and Alaric offered a polite bow, thanked the family for their hospitality, and departed. Eleanor watched his carriage disappear down the long drive from the window of her chamber. She stood there for a long while, long after the carriage had vanished from sight, her hand pressed against the cool glass, her mind racing with thoughts she could not quiet. Somewhere across the county, Margaret Whitfield was waking up in her own home, unaware of the storm that had passed through her dearest friend's heart the night before. She rose with excitement bubbling in her chest, eager to write to Eleanor about the wedding plans beginning to take shape, eager to share every small detail with the person she trusted most in the world. She had no idea that the very foundation of that trust was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. As the morning light spilled across the estate, Eleanor finally turned from the window and began the long, difficult work of preparing herself for what was to come. She did not know, not yet, how deeply this engagement would test her loyalty, her friendship, and her own understanding of what she truly wanted from life. She only knew that the calm she had shown at dinner was merely the first layer of a mask she would need to wear for a long time to come. And somewhere deep within her, beneath the grief and the guilt and the carefully maintained composure, a small ember of hope refused to be extinguished, waiting quietly for whatever the future might bring. 3 days after the dinner where Alaric made his announcement, Eleanor sat in her private sitting room, a stack of unanswered letters before her. Most were invitations, notes from acquaintances, small matters of daily life that required little thought. But one letter, tucked beneath the others, was written in Margaret's familiar, looping handwriting, and Eleanor had been avoiding it since it arrived that morning. She finally picked it up, broke the wax seal, and began to read. Margaret's words spilled across the page with unrestrained joy. She wrote of the Duke's kindness, of how nervous she had been when he first began courting her, of how surprised and delighted she felt that a man of his standing had chosen her, a woman with a modest dowry and no great family name to speak of. She wrote of dress fabrics and flower arrangements, of guest lists and travel plans for the honeymoon, of 100 small details that filled her with excitement. Eleanor read every word carefully, her chest tightening with each line. She could hear Margaret's voice in the letter, could picture her friend's bright eyes and eager smile as she wrote it. There was no trace of doubt in Margaret's words, no hint of hesitation. She was happy, truly and completely happy, and that happiness made Eleanor's own grief feel selfish and small by comparison. She set the letter down and pressed her hands against her face for a long moment, gathering herself before picking up her pen to write a reply. "Dearest Margaret," she began, "I am overjoyed to hear of your happiness. The Duke is a fortunate man indeed, and I have no doubt you will make each other very happy." The words felt hollow as she wrote them, but she continued anyway, asking about the wedding plans, offering to help with any preparations Margaret might need, expressing enthusiasm she did not entirely feel, but knew she must project. This was the role she had chosen for herself, the role of the supportive friend, and she intended to play it well, no matter the cost to her own heart. To understand why Eleanor felt so deeply torn, one must look back to the years that had shaped her friendship with both Margaret and Alaric. Eleanor and Margaret had met as young girls, brought together by their father's business dealings, and a shared tutor who taught them French and mathematics in a small schoolroom above Margaret's family home. From the very beginning, they had been inseparable. Margaret was warm where Eleanor was reserved, spontaneous where Eleanor was careful, and somehow their differences had only strengthened the bond between them rather than driving them apart. It was Margaret who had first introduced Eleanor to social gatherings beyond their small circle, coaxing her out of her natural shyness and into conversations with people she might otherwise have avoided. It was Margaret who had stayed by her side through the death of Eleanor's mother, refusing to leave her alone even when Eleanor insisted she wished for solitude. And it was Margaret who had, without ever knowing it, introduced Eleanor more deeply into Alaric's world, for the Whitfield and Ashworth families had long maintained a friendly acquaintance, and it was through Margaret's family gatherings that Eleanor had spent countless hours in Alaric's company over the years. Alaric, for his part, had grown from the serious young boy who once offered Eleanor a wilted rose into a man burdened with responsibilities far beyond his years. His father had passed when Alaric was only 19, leaving him to manage a vast estate, numerous tenants, and the expectations of an entire family name. He had grown quieter over the years, more guarded, though Eleanor had always been able to draw out the warmth that still existed beneath his composed exterior. Their friendship had deepened gradually, through long conversations in the Ashworth library, through letters exchanged when duty kept them apart, through small moments that meant nothing to anyone else, but carried enormous weight between the two of them. Eleanor remembered the winter 3 years ago, when a snowstorm had trapped her at the Ashworth estate for nearly a week, and how she and Alaric had spent the long, quiet evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, until it felt as though they understood each other more completely than anyone else ever could. She remembered, too, the moment she had first realized her feelings for him ran deeper than friendship. It had been a summer evening, the two of them walking through the same rose garden where he had once given her that first flower. He had been telling her about the pressures of managing his estate, the weight of expectations he carried, and for a brief moment, his careful composure had cracked, revealing the exhaustion and loneliness beneath. She had reached out and taken his hand, offering silent comfort, and he had held on to it far longer than propriety allowed, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that had taken her breath away. Nothing had come of that moment. No words were spoken, no promises made. They had simply stood there, hands clasped, until the moment passed and they returned to the house as though nothing unusual had occurred. But Eleanor had carried the memory of it ever since, holding on to it as proof that whatever she felt for him was not entirely one-sided. Now, sitting in her sitting room with Margaret's joyful letter before her, Eleanor wondered if she had been foolish to hold on to that memory for so long. Perhaps it had meant nothing to Alaric at all. Perhaps she had built an entire castle of hope upon a foundation of nothing more than a single, fleeting moment that he had long since forgotten. Her brother Edmund knocked on her door that afternoon, entering without waiting for a response, as was his habit. He found her still seated at her writing desk, Margaret's letter open before her, an unfinished reply beside it. "You have been in here for hours," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," Eleanor replied, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Edmund studied her for a long moment. He was 3 years younger than Eleanor, but he had always possessed a perceptiveness that belied his age, particularly when it came to his sister. He had noticed her behavior at dinner the other night, the way she had so carefully controlled every word and gesture, and he had spent the days since wondering what lay beneath that careful control. "I know you well enough to recognize when you are not being entirely honest with me," he said gently. "This news of the Duke's engagement has troubled you more than you are willing to admit." Eleanor set down her pen and looked at her brother, considering how much to reveal. She had never spoken openly with anyone about her feelings for Alaric, not even Edmund, who she trusted more than almost anyone. But the weight of carrying this secret alone had grown heavier with each passing day, and she found herself suddenly, desperately wanting to share the burden with someone. "I have cared for him for a long time," she admitted quietly. "Longer than I have allowed myself to fully acknowledge, even to myself." Edmund did not seem surprised by this confession. "I have suspected as much for years," he said. "The way you speak of him, the way your entire demeanor changes when his name is mentioned. I had hoped, for your sake, that something might eventually come of it." "As did I," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it seems I was mistaken to hope for such a thing." "Have you considered telling him how you feel?" Edmund asked. "Before the wedding takes place?" Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I could never do such a thing. Margaret is my dearest friend. I will not betray her trust by pursuing a man she is soon to marry, regardless of my own feelings. That is not the kind of person I wish to be." Edmund nodded slowly, understanding the depth of conviction behind his sister's words, even as he recognized the pain it was causing her. "Then what will you do?" "I will support Margaret through her wedding preparations," Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders with renewed resolve. "I will smile and offer my congratulations and help, however I am needed. And in time, perhaps this ache in my heart will fade, and I will find peace with the way things have turned out." Edmund did not look entirely convinced by this plan, but he did not press the matter further. He understood his sister well enough to know that once she had set her mind upon a course of action, little could dissuade her from it, no matter how difficult that course might prove to be. After Edmund left her sitting room, Eleanor returned to her unfinished letter to Margaret, determined to complete it with the warmth and enthusiasm her friend deserved. She wrote of dress fabrics she thought would suit Margaret's coloring, of flower arrangements that might complement a spring wedding, of small suggestions and offers of help that she hoped would bring her friend joy, even as each word cost her something internally. When she finished the letter, she sealed it carefully and set it aside to be delivered the following morning. Then she rose from her desk and walked to her window, looking out over the estate grounds as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. She thought of Alaric, wondering where he was at that moment, what he was doing, whether he thought of her at all amid the whirlwind of wedding preparations that surely occupied his days. She wondered if the memory of that summer evening in the rose garden meant as much to him as it did to her, or if it had faded into nothing more than a forgotten moment among countless others. She did not know the answer, and she told herself, firmly, that it did not matter. The wedding would proceed. Margaret would become the Duchess of Ashworth, and Eleanor would remain, as she always had, a devoted friend, standing quietly on the sidelines of other people's happiness. But even as she made this vow to herself, a small part of her heart refused to fully accept it, holding on to a fragile hope that she could not entirely explain, even to herself. The days that followed brought a flurry of activity to both households. Margaret threw herself into wedding preparations with characteristic enthusiasm, sending frequent letters to Eleanor, detailing every decision, every small triumph and minor setback, in planning the celebration of her upcoming marriage. Eleanor responded to each letter with careful warmth, offering suggestions and encouragement, while privately struggling with the emotional toll of watching her dearest friend prepare to marry the man she herself had loved in silence for years. Alaric, meanwhile, remained largely occupied with the practical matters of his estate, though he found his thoughts drifting to Eleanor far more often than he cared to admit. He told himself these thoughts were merely the product of long friendship, nothing more. But late at night, when the house grew quiet and his mind was free to wander, he found himself remembering moments they had shared over the years, with a clarity and longing that troubled him deeply. He had not told anyone, not even Margaret, about the true depth of his history with Eleanor. He had convinced himself, over the months of his courtship with Margaret, that whatever he had once felt for Eleanor was a passing fancy of youth, something he had outgrown as duty and responsibility took precedence in his life. But announcing his engagement to Eleanor's face, watching her calm and composed reaction, had shaken something loose within him that he could not easily put back into place. He found himself, more than once, drafting letters to her that he never sent, attempting to explain feelings he barely understood himself. Each time, he would read over what he had written, recognize the danger in such words, and cast the letter into the fire before it could ever reach her. Neither Eleanor nor Alaric spoke of these private struggles to anyone. They carried their burdens separately, each convinced they were protecting the people they loved by remaining silent. But silence, as both would come to learn, has a way of allowing wounds to fester rather than heal, and the truth they both avoided would not remain buried forever. Margaret Whitfield woke early on the morning she was to visit the dressmaker in town, her heart light with anticipation. She dressed quickly, humming a soft tune to herself as her maid arranged her hair, and made her way downstairs to a breakfast she barely tasted, too excited to focus on anything but the day ahead. She had invited Eleanor to join her for the dress fitting, eager to share this milestone with the person she considered closer than any sister. As she waited by the window for Eleanor's carriage to arrive, Margaret allowed herself to reflect on how her life had changed in recent months. She had never expected to catch the attention of a duke. Her family, while respectable, held nowhere near the standing of the Ashworth name, and she had always assumed her future would involve a modest match with a gentleman of similar means. When Alaric had first begun paying her attention at a gathering the previous autumn, she had assumed it was simple courtesy, nothing more. It was only after several weeks of continued visits, thoughtful gifts, and increasingly personal conversations that she allowed herself to hope his interest might run deeper. She remembered the evening he had finally proposed, down on one knee in her family's modest garden, his expression uncharacteristically nervous for a man usually so composed. She had said yes before he even finished the question, laughing through happy tears, and he had smiled, truly smiled, in a way she had rarely seen from him before. Since that evening, Margaret had felt as though she were living inside a dream she never wanted to wake from. She loved Alaric, or at least she believed she did, though if pressed, she might have struggled to articulate exactly what that love felt like. She admired him greatly, respected his intelligence and his sense of duty, and found herself genuinely happy in his presence. Whether this constituted the kind of deep, romantic love spoken of in novels, she could not say with certainty, but she had convinced herself it was enough, and that with time, whatever gaps existed in her feelings would surely fill themselves in. Eleanor's carriage arrived, and Margaret hurried out to greet her friend with an enthusiastic embrace. "I am so glad you could come," she said, linking her arm through Eleanor's as they walked toward the waiting carriage together. "I could not possibly choose a wedding dress without your opinion." "I would not have missed it for anything," Eleanor replied, and though her smile was warm, Margaret noticed a slight tightness around her friend's eyes that she could not quite place. "Is everything well with you?" Margaret asked, as they settled into the carriage. "You have seemed a bit distant these past few weeks." "I have simply had a great deal on my mind," Eleanor said smoothly. "My father has been discussing a potential match for me, with a family in the eastern counties, and I confess the prospect fills me with little enthusiasm." This was not entirely untrue, though Eleanor had deliberately exaggerated her concern over the matter, to provide a convincing explanation for her recent distraction. Margaret, ever sympathetic, immediately offered comfort and advice, entirely unaware that the true source of her friend's distress sat far closer to home than any proposed marriage arrangement in the eastern counties. The dressmaker's shop bustled with activity when they arrived, bolts of fine fabric lining the walls in every imaginable shade. Margaret's excitement returned in full force as she examined silks and laces, holding different fabrics up against her skin to judge how they might look in candlelight during an evening ceremony. "What do you think of this one?" she asked, holding up a length of pale ivory silk embroidered with delicate silver thread. "Do you think it would suit me?" "It is beautiful," Eleanor said, and meant it, even as a small, unwelcome part of her mind wondered what it might feel like to be the one standing in that fabric, preparing to marry Alaric herself. She pushed the thought away immediately, ashamed of its intrusion, and focused instead on helping Margaret select accessories to complement the gown. They spent the better part of the afternoon at the dressmaker's shop, Margaret trying on various designs while Eleanor offered opinions and encouragement. Despite the emotional difficulty of the task, Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying moments of the afternoon, caught up in Margaret's infectious joy despite herself. This was, after all, still her dearest friend, and years of genuine affection could not be entirely overshadowed by her own private grief. As they left the shop that evening, Margaret suddenly turned to Eleanor with a curious expression. "May I ask you something rather personal?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, her heart beginning to race despite her outward calm. "You have known Alaric for many years, longer than I have," Margaret said. "What is he truly like? I mean, beneath the composure he shows to the world. I sometimes feel as though I am marrying a man I do not fully know, despite our courtship." Eleanor took a moment before answering, choosing her words with great care. "He is kind," she said finally. "Kinder than most people realize, because he does not show it openly to everyone. He carries a great deal of responsibility, and it has made him guarded. But underneath that guard, he feels things deeply. He is loyal, and he values honesty, even when honesty is difficult." Margaret listened intently, nodding slowly. "I hope in time he will feel comfortable enough to show me that side of himself more fully." "I am certain he will," Eleanor said, and found herself hoping it was true, even as the words caused a fresh ache in her chest. "He simply needs time to trust that it is safe to do so." "Thank you," Margaret said, squeezing her friend's hand warmly. "I do not know what I would do without your friendship, Eleanor. You have always understood me, and now you understand him as well. I feel fortunate to have you helping guide me through all of this." Eleanor forced a smile, the weight of Margaret's trust settling heavily upon her shoulders. "I will always be here for you," she said, and meant every word, even as she silently wondered how long she could continue bearing this particular burden without breaking beneath its weight. That evening, after returning home, Eleanor retreated to her chamber and sat by her window for a long while, replaying the day's conversation in her mind. Margaret's question had struck deeper than her friend could possibly have realized. Eleanor did know Alaric, perhaps better than anyone else alive, and that knowledge had become both a comfort and a curse in recent weeks. She thought about what she had told Margaret, about the guarded kindness beneath his composed exterior, and wondered whether she had done the right thing by sharing such insight. Part of her had wanted to withhold this knowledge, to keep it as something private between herself and Alaric alone, but she had recognized, even as the selfish thought crossed her mind, how unfair such a withholding would be to Margaret, who deserved to understand the man she was about to marry as fully as possible. Eleanor's father knocked softly on her door that evening, entering to find his daughter seated quietly by the window, lost in thought. He had noticed her distraction in recent weeks as well, though he attributed it to nerves over the proposed match with the family in the eastern counties, unaware of the true source of her troubled thoughts. "I received word today that Lord Pembroke's family wishes to arrange a meeting between you and their son," he said, settling into a chair near her. "I know you have expressed reservations, but I believe it would be wise to at least consider the match. He comes from good standing, and the union would benefit our family considerably." Eleanor turned from the window, her expression carefully neutral. "I will consider it, father, though I confess my heart is not entirely inclined toward marriage at present." Her father studied her for a long moment, his expression softening. "Is there someone else who has captured your heart, Eleanor? You may speak freely with me, whatever the truth may be." The question caught Eleanor off guard, and for a brief, dangerous moment, she considered confessing everything to her father. The years of quiet affection for Alaric, the pain of his engagement to her dearest friend, the exhausting effort of maintaining her composure, while her heart quietly broke. But she caught herself, before the words could escape, recognizing the impossibility of the situation she would create, by voicing such feelings aloud. "There is no one, father," she said instead. "I simply wish to be certain before committing to such an important decision. Marriage is not something to be entered into lightly." Her father nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, though a flicker of doubt remained in his eyes, as he studied his daughter's carefully composed expression. He had known Eleanor her entire life, and he recognized, even if he could not name it precisely, that something troubled her more deeply than she was willing to admit. "Take whatever time you need," he said finally, rising from his chair. "I only wish for your happiness, whatever form that happiness might take." After he left, Eleanor returned her attention to the window, watching the last traces of daylight fade into evening darkness. She thought of Lord Pembroke's son, a pleasant enough young man she had met on several occasions, though she felt nothing beyond polite friendliness toward him. She thought of the eastern counties, of the life she might build there if she agreed to such a match, far removed from Alaric and Margaret, and the wedding that would soon bind them together permanently. Perhaps distance would provide the relief her heart so desperately needed. Perhaps removing herself entirely from their circle would allow the wound to heal in ways that remaining close to them never could. But even as she considered this possibility, she knew she could not abandon Margaret during the most important preparations of her life. Whatever pain remained in her own heart, her loyalty to her dearest friend outweighed her personal comfort. She would remain, she would help plan the wedding, and she would find some way to survive watching the man she loved marry someone else. It was, she told herself firmly, simply a matter of endurance, and if there was one thing Eleanor Vance had proven herself capable of throughout her life, it was enduring hardship with grace and composure, regardless of the cost to her own heart. The following weeks brought continued preparations for the wedding, with Eleanor playing an increasingly central role in the planning, much to Margaret's delight and gratitude. She helped select flowers, reviewed menu options with the caterers, and offered guidance on countless small details that Margaret, in her excitement, might otherwise have overlooked. Throughout it all, Eleanor maintained her careful composure, smiling through moments that privately caused her considerable pain, offering enthusiasm for celebrations that marked the beginning of a life she had once quietly hoped might be her own. She grew skilled at this particular performance, so skilled that even Edmund, who knew the truth of her feelings, sometimes wondered whether his sister had truly begun to make peace with the situation. She had not. But she had learned, through necessity, how to carry her grief quietly, allowing it to exist alongside her genuine love for Margaret, without letting either emotion overwhelm the delicate balance she had constructed to survive the coming months. Whether this balance could hold indefinitely remained to be seen. Rain fell steadily against the windows of the Vance estate. On the afternoon, Eleanor decided to clean out an old storage chest that had belonged to her mother. She had been putting off the task for months, unable to bring herself to sort through the remaining possessions of a woman she still grieved deeply. But with the wedding preparations occupying so much of her thoughts, she found herself craving a quiet, solitary task to occupy an otherwise idle afternoon. She climbed to the attic, a space rarely visited by anyone in the household, and began sorting through the contents of the chest with careful, deliberate movements. Old dresses, faded from years of storage, lay folded beneath stacks of letters and small trinkets that had once meant something to her mother. Eleanor examined each item slowly, allowing herself moments of quiet reflection as memories surfaced unbidden. Near the bottom of the chest, tucked beneath a folded shawl, she discovered a small wooden box she did not immediately recognize. She lifted it carefully and opened the lid, expecting to find more of her mother's belongings. Instead, she found a bundle of letters tied together with faded ribbon, the handwriting on the outer envelope unmistakably familiar. It was Alaric's handwriting. Confused, Eleanor untied the ribbon and began reading through the letters, her confusion quickly turning to shock as she realized these were letters Alaric had written to her years ago, during that winter she had been snowed in at his estate. She remembered writing to him frequently during that period, but she did not remember these particular letters, nor could she understand why they would be found among her mother's belongings, rather than her own. As she read further, understanding began to dawn, slow and devastating. The letters spoke openly of feelings Alaric had never voiced aloud in her presence. He wrote of his growing affection for her, of dreams he harbored for a future together, of hesitations rooted in his fear that his family's expectations might prevent such a future from ever becoming reality. In one letter, dated nearly 3 years prior, he had written explicitly of his intention to speak with her father about a potential courtship, once he felt more secure in his position as head of the Ashworth estate. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read this particular letter multiple times, searching for some explanation as to why she had never received it, why these words of genuine intention had been kept from her for so long. She found her answer in the final letter of the bundle, this one written not by Alaric, but by her own mother, addressed to Alaric himself, though it appeared this response had never been sent, remaining instead tucked away with the letters it responded to. Her mother had written with careful, measured words, explaining that while she recognized the sincerity of Alaric's feelings for Eleanor, she believed the match would bring hardship rather than happiness. She cited concerns about the difference in their social standing, worries that Eleanor might struggle beneath the weight of expectations placed upon a duchess, and a deep maternal desire to protect her daughter from potential heartbreak should the match ultimately fail to receive approval from the wider Ashworth family. Eleanor read this letter 3 times, her chest tightening with each pass through the careful, loving words her mother had written. She understood, even through her shock and grief, that her mother had acted from a place of genuine concern, believing she was protecting her daughter from a future filled with potential pain and rejection. But understanding the intention behind the action did not lessen the devastating impact of discovering it now, years later, after the opportunity these letters represented had already slipped irrevocably away. She sat on the dusty attic floor for a long while, the letters scattered around her, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks as the full weight of the discovery settled upon her. Alaric had cared for her, truly and deeply, years ago. He had intended to pursue a future with her, and her mother, acting from love but perhaps misguided judgment, had intervened, preventing that future from ever coming to pass. Had her mother responded differently, had she encouraged rather than discouraged the match, Eleanor might now be the one preparing for a spring wedding, rather than watching from the sidelines as her dearest friend prepared to marry the man she loved. The unfairness of it threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She gathered the letters carefully, tying them once more with the faded ribbon, and made her way down from the attic, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had discovered. She needed time to process this revelation before deciding what, if anything, to do with this new knowledge. Edmund found her later that evening, sitting alone in the library, with the bundle of letters clutched tightly in her hands. He recognized immediately that something significant had occurred, her carefully maintained composure entirely absent for the first time since the announcement of Alaric's engagement. "Eleanor, what has happened?" he asked, settling beside her with obvious concern. Wordlessly, she handed him the letters, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock as he read through them himself. When he finished, he set them down carefully and turned to his sister with an expression of deep sympathy. "I did not know," he said quietly. "I had no idea Mother had intervened in such a way." "Neither did I," Eleanor replied, her voice hollow. "All these years, I convinced myself that whatever I felt for him was foolish, one-sided fancy that would never be reciprocated. And now I discover he felt the same, that he intended to pursue a future with me, and that our own mother prevented it from ever coming to pass." "What will you do with this knowledge?" Edmund asked carefully. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I do not know. Part of me wishes to confront Alaric, to ask him why he never pursued the matter further himself, why he allowed our mother's response, or lack thereof, to end the possibility entirely, rather than approaching me directly. But another part of me recognizes that doing so now would serve no purpose beyond causing further pain, both to myself and to Margaret." "You cannot simply pretend you never found these letters," Edmund said gently. "Such knowledge, once gained, cannot be easily set aside." "I am aware of that," Eleanor said, a note of frustration creeping into her voice for the first time. "But what would you have me do, Edmund? Storm into Alaric's estate and demand explanations for events that occurred years ago? Beg him to abandon his engagement to Margaret, based on feelings he may no longer even hold? I have spent years learning to accept the boundaries of propriety and duty. I cannot simply abandon those principles now, regardless of how deeply this discovery has affected me." Edmund fell silent, recognizing the truth in his sister's words, even as he wished there existed some clearer path forward for her to pursue. He had always admired Eleanor's strength, her ability to maintain composure and dignity, even under the most difficult circumstances. But watching her struggle now, clearly torn between old feelings and new knowledge, he found himself wishing, for her sake, that some resolution might present itself that would not require her to sacrifice her own happiness entirely for the sake of others. "Perhaps," he said finally, "you should simply allow yourself time to sit with this knowledge before deciding on any course of action. There is no need to act immediately, particularly on a matter of such emotional significance." Eleanor nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his suggestion. "You are right, of course. I will take time to consider what, if anything, should be done with this discovery." She spent the following days in quiet contemplation, the bundle of letters hidden away in her own chamber now, taken out and reread during private moments, when she needed to remind herself that her feelings for Alaric had not been entirely one-sided, that somewhere in their shared history existed genuine mutual affection, that circumstances beyond either of their control had prevented from flourishing into something more. She found herself watching Alaric more closely during their subsequent interactions, searching for any sign that he might still harbor the feelings expressed in those old letters, wondering whether his engagement to Margaret was truly a matter of contentment, or whether, like her, he carried private regrets about a path not taken. She did not find clear answers, for Alaric remained as guarded and composed in her presence as ever, giving little indication of his internal state. But she noticed small things, subtle glances, that lingered perhaps a moment too long, brief hesitations before he spoke to her, that suggested careful consideration of his words, in ways he did not exhibit with others. Whether these observations represented genuine evidence of lingering feelings or simply her own hopeful imagination reading significance into ordinary interactions, Eleanor could not say with certainty. But the discovery of those letters had reignited something within her that she had worked hard to suppress, a small flame of hope that refused to be entirely extinguished, regardless of how impractical or potentially destructive that hope might prove to be. She knew she needed to decide, eventually, what to do with this new knowledge, whether to confront Alaric directly, to confide in Margaret, or to simply carry the secret quietly within herself, as she had carried so many other burdens throughout her life. Each option carried significant risk, significant potential for pain, not only to herself but to the people she cared about most deeply. For now, she chose silence, continuing to help with wedding preparations, while privately wrestling with a decision that grew more urgent with each passing day, as the spring wedding date drew steadily closer. The weight of unspoken truth pressed heavily upon her, a burden she carried alone through long, sleepless nights, uncertain of what the right path forward might look like, or whether such a path even existed, given the complicated circumstances she now found herself navigating. Weeks passed, and Eleanor made a decision she hoped would preserve both her dignity and her friendship with Margaret. She would not confront Alaric about the letters. She would not confide in Margaret about her feelings. Instead, she would channel her energy into the wedding preparations, with such thoroughness and dedication that she would have little time remaining to dwell on thoughts that served no productive purpose. She threw herself into the task with remarkable determination. She spent long hours with Margaret discussing seating arrangements for the ceremony, coordinated with florists, to ensure every arrangement matched the vision Margaret had described since childhood, and even took it upon herself to review contracts with the catering staff to ensure every detail met the highest standard. Margaret noticed this shift in her friend's behavior and expressed gratitude at every opportunity. "I do not know how I would manage any of this without you," she said one afternoon as they reviewed invitation lists together in Margaret's family parlor. "You have such a talent for organization, Eleanor. I feel as though I could hand you complete control of this wedding and trust that everything would be perfect." "I am glad to help," Eleanor replied, and there was genuine truth in these words, even amid the complicated emotions underlying her involvement. Focusing on practical details provided a welcome distraction from the ache that still lived within her heart, and watching Margaret's genuine happiness, however painful it might be to witness, still brought her a measure of quiet satisfaction, rooted in years of true friendship. Alaric, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn into conversations with Eleanor as the wedding planning progressed, given her central role in coordinating various aspects of the ceremony and celebration. He told himself these interactions were purely practical in nature, necessary discussions about logistics and arrangements that required his input as the groom. But he found himself, more often than he cared to admit, seeking out opportunities to speak with her beyond what strict necessity required. One afternoon, he arrived at the Whitfield estate to discuss arrangements for the wedding breakfast, only to find Margaret occupied with a fitting for her wedding dress and unavailable for their scheduled meeting. Eleanor, who had been reviewing menu options in the study, offered to discuss the matter in Margaret's absence, given her familiarity with the details already agreed upon. They sat together at the study table, papers spread between them, discussing the merits of various dishes and the logistics of seating arrangements. The conversation began purely practical in nature, but as it progressed, old patterns of easy conversation began to reassert themselves, and soon they found themselves discussing matters entirely unrelated to the wedding at all. "Do you remember," Alaric said suddenly, setting down the paper he had been reviewing, "the winter you were snowed in, at my estate? We spent nearly a week, trapped indoors together." Eleanor's heart skipped at the memory, though she maintained her composed expression. "I remember it well. We nearly exhausted the entire library, attempting to occupy ourselves through those long, snowy days. I have often thought back on that week," Alaric continued, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of vulnerability. "It remains among my most treasured memories, if I am honest." Eleanor studied him carefully, wondering whether this admission carried the weight she suspected it might, or whether she was simply reading significance into words that meant nothing more than casual nostalgia. "As do I," she said finally, choosing her words with great care. "Those were simpler times, before the responsibilities of adulthood fully claimed our attention." "Simpler times," Alaric repeated softly, his gaze drifting toward the window, lost momentarily in memory. "I sometimes wonder how different my life might have turned out, had circumstances allowed certain possibilities to unfold differently during that period." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eleanor's pulse quickened, and for a brief, dangerous moment, She considered revealing the letters she had discovered, considered asking him directly what possibilities he referred to, whether he too carried regrets about paths never taken. But the study door opened before she could speak, and Margaret entered, her wedding fitting complete, her expression bright with excitement over the final adjustments made to her gown. The moment shattered instantly, both Eleanor and Alaric quickly returning their attention to the papers before them, the conversation retreating back into safe, practical territory. "What have I missed?" Margaret asked cheerfully, settling into a chair beside Alaric and reaching for his hand with easy familiarity. "We were simply discussing the seating arrangements for the wedding breakfast," Eleanor said smoothly, her composure fully restored despite the racing of her heart moments before. "I believe we have settled on an arrangement that should please everyone." The conversation continued in this practical vein for the remainder of the visit, with no further mention of snowy winters or unfulfilled possibilities. But Eleanor carried the weight of that brief, charged exchange with her, long after she returned home that evening, replaying Alaric's words in her mind, searching for meaning within them that she could not entirely dismiss. That night, unable to sleep, she retrieved the bundle of letters from their hiding place and read through them once more, this time with fresh perspective granted by the day's conversation. Alaric's written words from years ago now seemed to align more closely with the vulnerability he had shown that afternoon, suggesting that whatever feelings he had once expressed on paper might not have entirely faded with the passage of time, despite his current engagement to her dearest friend. She knew, with growing certainty, that she needed to speak with him directly, to understand once and for all whether the feelings expressed in those old letters remained relevant to his present circumstances, or whether she was simply grasping at fragments of a past that no longer held any bearing on his current commitments and intentions. But finding an appropriate opportunity for such a conversation proved challenging, given the constant presence of others during their interactions, and Eleanor's own reluctance to create a situation that might compromise her friendship with Margaret or Alaric's engagement, regardless of her personal feelings on the matter. The opportunity finally presented itself nearly 2 weeks later, during a garden party hosted by the Ashworth family to celebrate the upcoming wedding. The event drew a substantial crowd, with guests scattered throughout the extensive gardens, engaged in various conversations and activities. Eleanor found herself briefly separated from the main gathering, having wandered toward a quieter section of the garden to escape the noise and press of so many people. She did not expect to encounter Alaric there, having assumed him occupied with hosting duties among the primary gathering. But he appeared suddenly from around a hedge, seemingly as surprised to find her there as she was to see him. "I did not expect to find you here," he said, approaching slowly. "I thought you were engaged in conversation with Lady Pemberton near the fountain." "I needed a moment away from the crowd," Eleanor admitted. "These large gatherings can grow overwhelming after a time." "I understand the sentiment entirely," Alaric said, settling onto a nearby bench, gesturing for her to join him. She hesitated only briefly before accepting, sitting a respectable distance away, despite the private nature of their location. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the distant party drifting toward them on the afternoon breeze. Eleanor considered the letters once more, considered the weight of the question she had been carrying for weeks, and finally found the courage to voice it aloud. "Alaric," she said carefully, "I discovered something recently that I have been struggling to understand. I found letters, old letters, you wrote to me years ago, during the winter of the snowstorm. Letters that were never delivered to me, kept instead among my mother's belongings, along with a response she apparently never sent." Alaric's expression shifted immediately, surprise, and something that looked remarkably like relief crossing his features in quick succession. "You found those letters?" "I did," Eleanor confirmed. "I read of your intentions, of your plan to speak with my father about a potential courtship. I also read my mother's response, explaining her concerns about such a match, and her decision, evidently, to prevent it from proceeding further." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation with visible difficulty. "I had wondered, for years, why you never responded to those letters. I assumed you had read them, and simply chosen not to reciprocate my feelings. It never occurred to me that they had been intercepted before reaching you at all." "Neither of us knew the truth," Eleanor said softly. "We have spent years operating under false assumptions, believing our feelings were unrequited, when in fact, they were simply obstructed by circumstances beyond our control. This changes things considerably, Alaric said, his voice carrying a note of distress that Eleanor had rarely heard from him. I proceeded with my courtship of Margaret, believing you had rejected my earlier advances, however indirectly. Had I known the truth, I cannot say with certainty how differently things might have unfolded. Eleanor felt her heart racing at this admission, torn between hope and the harsh reality of their current circumstances. But you are engaged to Margaret now, she said carefully. Regardless of what might have been, that is the reality we must now navigate. Yes, Alaric agreed, though his voice carried little conviction. That is indeed our current reality. They sat together in troubled silence, the weight of this new understanding settling heavily between them, neither entirely certain what path forward might exist, given the complicated tangle of history, obligation, and feeling that now bound them together in ways neither had fully anticipated. Alaric returned to his estate that evening carrying the weight of the garden conversation heavily upon his shoulders. He retreated to his study, dismissing his valet for the night, and sat alone before the fireplace, staring into the flames as he attempted to sort through the tangle of emotions the revelation about the letters had stirred within him. For years he had believed his feelings for Eleanor had gone unreciprocated, that whatever affection he harbored toward her existed as a foolish, one-sided attachment best set aside in favor of practical considerations regarding his family's future. This belief had allowed him to proceed with his courtship of Margaret with a clear conscience, convinced he was making a sensible decision, unencumbered by unrequited longing for someone who did not share his feelings. Now he understood that assumption had been entirely false. Eleanor had cared for him, perhaps still did care for him, and their mutual feelings had been kept apart, not by lack of reciprocation, but by circumstances neither of them had been aware of at the time. This knowledge shifted the entire foundation upon which he had built his decision to marry Margaret. He thought of Margaret, of her genuine kindness and warmth, of the comfortable companionship they had built together over the months of their courtship. He did care for her, deeply in some respects, though he recognized now, with painful clarity, that his feelings for her existed on a different plane entirely from what he felt for Eleanor. His affection for Margaret was built on friendship, respect, and practical compatibility. His feelings for Eleanor ran deeper, touching something more fundamental within himself that he had spent years attempting to suppress in favor of duty and responsibility. To understand the full weight of his current predicament, one needed to understand the pressures that had shaped Alaric's decisions throughout his adult life. His father's death when Alaric was only 19 had thrust him into responsibilities far beyond his years, leaving him to manage a vast estate, with tenants depending upon his careful stewardship for their livelihoods. His mother, though loving, had made clear from an early age her expectations regarding an advantageous marriage that would strengthen the family's position and secure their financial future for generations to come. Margaret's family, while respectable, did not possess significant wealth or influential connections. His mother had initially expressed reservations about the match, though she had eventually relented, recognizing Margaret's genuine kindness and Alaric's evident happiness in her company as sufficient justification for the union, even if it did not align perfectly with her original ambitions for her son's marriage. Eleanor's family occupied a similarly modest position in society, her father's merchant background carrying even less traditional prestige than Margaret's landed gentry status. Had Alaric pursued a courtship with Eleanor years ago, he would have faced significant resistance from his mother, resistance he had not felt equipped to navigate during the difficult early years following his father's death, when he was still establishing his own authority and confidence as head of the family. This context, while not excusing his failure to pursue Eleanor more directly after receiving no response to his letters, at least explained the pressures that had shaped his subsequent decisions. He had convinced himself that pursuing Margaret represented a reasonable compromise, a match that would satisfy his mother's expectations, while still allowing him genuine happiness and companionship, even if it lacked the deeper connection he had once hoped to find with Eleanor. Now, sitting alone before his fireplace, Alaric found himself questioning whether this compromise had truly served him well, or whether he had simply talked himself into settling for something less than what his heart truly desired, out of fear and practical necessity, rather than genuine conviction. He thought about the wedding, now less than 2 months away, about the guests who had already been invited, the arrangements already made, the expectations of both families now firmly set in motion. Calling off such an engagement at this late stage would create scandal and hardship, particularly for Margaret, who had done nothing wrong beyond falling in love with a man whose heart, it now appeared, belonged at least partially to someone else. The thought of causing Margaret such pain filled him with genuine distress. She deserved better than to be cast aside for a woman she considered her dearest friend, deserved better than to have her happiness sacrificed for feelings that had only recently been fully understood and acknowledged between himself and Eleanor. And yet, the alternative, proceeding with a marriage, while harboring genuine feelings for another woman, felt equally dishonest and potentially damaging to everyone involved, including Margaret herself, who deserved a husband capable of loving her fully and completely, without the shadow of divided affection hanging over their union. Alaric spent the remainder of that evening wrestling with these competing obligations, finding no clear resolution to the impossible situation he now found himself facing. He finally retired to bed well past midnight, sleep offering little relief from the turbulent thoughts that continued to plague him even as exhaustion eventually claimed him. The following morning, he received a letter from his mother, inquiring about final preparations for the wedding and expressing her continued satisfaction with the match he had made. Reading her words, filled with genuine approval and excitement for the upcoming ceremony, only added to the weight of guilt already pressing upon him. He knew he needed to speak with Eleanor again, to fully understand where she stood regarding their current circumstances, before he could determine any appropriate path forward. But he also recognized the danger inherent in seeking out further private conversation with her, given the delicate nature of Margaret's trust and the potential damage that could result should their interactions be misinterpreted by others. He decided, ultimately, that he needed time to think clearly before taking any further action. He would continue with wedding preparations as planned, while privately searching for clarity regarding his true feelings and the most honorable path forward, given the complicated circumstances now surrounding his engagement. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself equally troubled by their garden conversation, replaying his words and expressions repeatedly in her mind as she attempted to determine what, if anything, might result from their shared acknowledgement of past feelings. She had not intended to reveal the existence of the letters when she first discovered them, had told herself she would carry that knowledge privately without ever confronting Alaric directly. But something about their conversation in the garden, the vulnerability he had shown regarding their shared history, had compelled her to speak the truth aloud, despite her earlier resolution to remain silent. Now, having voiced this truth, she found herself uncertain what should happen next. Alaric remained engaged to Margaret. The wedding continued to approach with each passing day, and despite the revelation that their feelings had once been mutual, nothing about their current circumstances had fundamentally changed. Margaret still loved Alaric, still anticipated their marriage with genuine joy and excitement, entirely unaware of the complicated history that existed between her fiancé and her dearest friend. Eleanor recognized, with growing clarity, that she faced a decision of significant moral weight. She could choose to remain silent, allowing the wedding to proceed as planned, while privately carrying the knowledge of what might have been, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of preserving Margaret's. Or she could pursue further conversation with Alaric, potentially opening a path toward a different outcome, though such a path would inevitably cause significant pain to Margaret and create lasting damage to their friendship, regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved itself. Neither option felt entirely satisfactory, and Eleanor found herself paralyzed by the weight of this decision, uncertain which path would ultimately cause less harm to the people she cared about most deeply, including herself. She sought out Edmund again that evening, needing someone to help her process the complicated emotions and decisions now facing her. He listened patiently as she described the garden conversation, Alaric's evident distress upon learning the truth about the intercepted letters, and her own uncertainty regarding how to proceed, given this new understanding between them. "What do you want, Eleanor?" Edmund asked finally, once she had finished recounting the details of the conversation. Setting aside considerations of Margaret, of propriety, of what others might think or expect, what does your own heart desire? Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, recognizing its importance despite the complexity of circumstances that made such simple desires difficult to pursue without significant consequence. I want him to choose me, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I have wanted that for years, long before I understood the full extent of my own feelings, but wanting something does not make pursuing it right, particularly when doing so would cause such significant harm to someone I love, as deeply as I love Margaret. Perhaps, Edmund said gently, the right course of action is not entirely within your control to determine alone. Alaric bears responsibility here as well. Responsibility to be honest with both you and Margaret about his true feelings and intentions, regardless of how difficult such honesty might prove. Eleanor nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her brother's words. She could not control Alaric's decisions, could not force him to choose one path or another, regardless of her own feelings on the matter. All she could control was her own honesty, her own willingness to acknowledge the truth of her feelings when appropriate, while ultimately respecting whatever decision Alaric made regarding his engagement to Margaret. With this understanding, she resolved to continue supporting the wedding preparations as she had before, while remaining open to further honest conversation with Alaric should the opportunity arise, without actively seeking to disrupt his engagement or manipulate the situation toward any particular outcome. Whatever happened next would need to unfold naturally, guided by honesty and genuine consideration for everyone involved, rather than through calculated maneuvering designed to achieve her own desired outcome, regardless of the cost to others. It was, she recognized, an imperfect resolution to an impossibly complicated situation, but it was the only path forward that allowed her to maintain her own sense of integrity, while honoring the deep bonds of friendship and loyalty that had shaped her relationships with both Margaret and Alaric throughout the years of their shared history together. The pre-wedding gathering hosted at the Ashworth estate, 3 weeks before the ceremony, brought together family and close friends from both sides, in a celebration meant to honor the upcoming union between Alaric and Margaret. The grand hall glittered with candlelight, musicians played softly in the corner, and guests mingled freely, offering congratulations and well wishes to the soon-to-be married couple. Eleanor arrived dressed in a gown of deep blue, her composure carefully maintained despite the turbulent emotions that had continued to churn within her since the garden conversation weeks prior. She had not spoken privately with Alaric since that day, both of them apparently maintaining careful distance, uncertain how to navigate the complicated truth now existing between them, without risking exposure of feelings that could not be openly acknowledged given the circumstances. Margaret, resplendent in a gown of soft rose color, moved through the gathering with characteristic warmth, greeting guests and accepting congratulations with genuine joy that lit up the entire room. Eleanor watched her friend from across the hall, admiring her happiness, even as it continued to stir complicated emotions within her own heart. "You look lovely this evening," Margaret said, approaching Eleanor with a bright smile as the evening progressed. "Though I confess, you have seemed somewhat troubled these past weeks. Is everything well with you?" "I am simply tired from all the wedding preparations," Eleanor said smoothly, offering the same explanation she had provided numerous times in recent weeks, to deflect concerns about her occasionally distracted demeanor. "Planning a wedding of this magnitude requires considerable energy, as you well know." Margaret laughed softly. "I am well aware. I could not have managed any of this without your tireless assistance, Eleanor. I hope you know how deeply grateful I am for everything you have done. There is nowhere else I would rather be than helping you prepare for this important day," Eleanor said, and despite the complicated truth underlying these words, she meant them sincerely. Regardless of her own private struggles, she genuinely wanted Margaret to experience the joy and celebration she deserved. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself briefly alone near the terrace doors, having stepped away from the main gathering to catch a moment of quiet reflection. She looked out over the darkened gardens, illuminated softly by lanterns hung throughout the grounds for the evening celebration, and allowed herself a rare moment of unguarded emotion, her carefully maintained composure slipping slightly in the privacy of the shadows. "You seem troubled this evening," a familiar voice said quietly behind her. She turned to find Alaric standing a respectful distance away, his expression carrying genuine concern beneath the polished exterior he presented to the wider gathering. "I did not realize my distress was so visible," she said, quickly attempting to reassemble her composure. "Only to someone who knows you well enough to recognize the signs," Alaric said, stepping closer, though still maintaining appropriate distance given the public nature of the setting, despite their current isolation near the terrace doors. I have thought a great deal about our conversation in the garden. I have not been able to think of much else, if I am entirely honest." Eleanor's heart raced at this admission, though she remained careful in her response, aware of the risk inherent in such a private conversation, occurring during an event specifically meant to celebrate his upcoming marriage to another woman. "As have I," she admitted quietly, "though I confess I do not know what should be done with such thoughts, given our current circumstances." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkened gardens beyond the terrace. "I care for Margaret," he said finally, his voice carrying genuine conviction. "I do not wish to cause her pain, and I recognize the significant harm that would result should I act upon feelings that threaten the commitment I have made to her." "I understand," Eleanor said, though her voice carried a note of quiet sorrow she could not entirely conceal. "But I also cannot pretend," Alaric continued, "that discovering the truth about those letters has not fundamentally altered my understanding of my own feelings, both toward you and toward the decision I made to pursue marriage with Margaret." Eleanor turned to face him fully now, searching his expression for clarity regarding what he intended to convey through these careful, measured words. "What are you saying, Alaric?" "I do not know," he admitted, frustration evident in his voice for the first time. "I know only that I feel caught between competing obligations, unable to determine the honorable path forward without causing significant pain to someone I care about, regardless of which direction I ultimately choose." Before Eleanor could respond, footsteps approached from within the hall, and they both quickly stepped apart, resuming appropriate distance as Margaret appeared in the terrace doorway, searching for her fiancé amid the ongoing celebration. "There you are," Margaret said, relief evident in her voice, as she spotted Alaric near the terrace. "I wondered where you had disappeared to. My mother wishes to introduce you to some cousins who have just arrived." "Of course," Alaric said, his composure instantly restored, despite the emotional intensity of the conversation just interrupted. "I apologize for wandering off. Eleanor and I were simply discussing some final details regarding the wedding breakfast arrangements." Margaret smiled, entirely unsuspecting of the true nature of the conversation she had interrupted. "Wonderful. I trust everything remains on schedule?" "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned," Eleanor confirmed, her voice steady, despite the internal turmoil still churning within her from the conversation with Alaric. Margaret linked her arm through Alaric's, leading him back toward the main gathering, throwing a warm smile toward Eleanor over her shoulder as they departed. "Do rejoin us soon, Eleanor. I do not wish for you to spend the entire evening hiding away on the terrace." "I will be along shortly," Eleanor promised, watching them disappear back into the crowded hall together. She remained on the terrace for several more minutes, gathering herself before rejoining the celebration, her mind racing with the implications of what Alaric had said, and more significantly, what he had left unsaid. He had not explicitly declared any intention to end his engagement with Margaret, nor had he explicitly declared enduring love for Eleanor herself. But the acknowledgement of his own internal conflict, the admission that discovering the truth about the letters had fundamentally altered his understanding of his feelings, suggested a depth of uncertainty that had not existed prior to that garden conversation weeks earlier. She wondered, with growing unease, whether her decision to reveal the existence of those letters had been wise, given the emotional turmoil it appeared to be causing Alaric as the wedding date drew ever closer. She had not intended to disrupt his engagement or create doubt regarding his commitment to Margaret. She had simply wanted honesty between them, wanted him to understand the truth of their shared history, rather than continuing to operate under false assumptions about unrequited feelings. But honesty, she was learning, carried its own complicated consequences, particularly when it arrived at inconvenient times, threatening to unravel carefully constructed plans and commitments that others depended upon for their own happiness and future stability. She finally rejoined the celebration, resuming her role as supportive friend and wedding coordinator with practiced ease, though her mind remained preoccupied throughout the remainder of the evening, with thoughts of the conversation on the terrace and its potential implications for the future. Later that night, after returning home, Eleanor found herself unable to settle into sleep, her thoughts continuing to churn with the weight of everything that had transpired. She rose from her bed and moved to her writing desk, pulling out paper and pen with sudden determination. She began writing a letter to Alaric, pouring out thoughts and feelings she had never dared voice aloud, explaining her own uncertainty regarding the appropriate path forward, acknowledging her enduring feelings for him, while also expressing genuine concern for Margaret's well-being and happiness. She wrote for nearly an hour, filling several pages with careful, thoughtful prose that captured the complexity of emotions she had been carrying since discovering those old letters weeks before. When she finished, she read through what she had written, considering whether to actually send such a letter, or whether doing so would only complicate matters further, potentially forcing a decision before either of them had fully processed the implications of their situation. Ultimately, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, unsent, uncertain whether she would ever find the courage to deliver it, or whether circumstances would eventually force a resolution to their complicated situation without requiring such a dramatic gesture on her part. The wedding remained 3 weeks away, and with each passing day, the pressure to resolve the uncertainty hanging over all three of their lives grew increasingly difficult to ignore, regardless of how carefully each of them attempted to maintain their composed exteriors in the face of such profound internal turmoil. Margaret Whitfield had always possessed a keen intuition for the emotions of those around her, a gift that had served her well throughout her life in cultivating deep, meaningful friendships. In the weeks following the pre-wedding gathering, this same intuition began sounding quiet alarms regarding the behavior of both her fiancé and her dearest friend, alarms she initially attempted to dismiss but found increasingly difficult to ignore as the wedding date drew closer. She noticed the way Alaric's expression shifted subtly whenever Eleanor entered a room, a flicker of something she could not quite name crossing his features before he composed himself into his usual pleasant demeanor. She noticed the way Eleanor sometimes grew quiet during conversations that mentioned the wedding directly, her responses carrying a careful, measured quality that felt different from the easy warmth Margaret had known from her friend throughout their years of close companionship. She told herself initially that she was simply imagining these subtle shifts, that pre-wedding anxiety was affecting her perception, causing her to search for problems that did not actually exist. But the pattern continued, small moments accumulating over successive weeks, until Margaret could no longer entirely dismiss the growing sense that something significant remained unspoken between the two people she trusted most in the world. The moment of clarity arrived unexpectedly during a quiet afternoon visit to Eleanor's chamber, where Margaret had come to discuss final adjustments to the wedding day timeline. While Eleanor stepped briefly from the room to retrieve additional notes, Margaret's attention wandered to the writing desk nearby, where a partially open drawer revealed the corner of a letter that had not been fully concealed. She should not have looked. She recognized this immediately, understanding the impropriety of examining her friend's private correspondence without permission. But something about the visible handwriting, unmistakably Alaric's, drew her attention, despite her better judgment. And before she could stop herself, she had opened the drawer further and begun reading the unsent letter within. The words struck her like a physical blow. Eleanor's careful, heartfelt prose revealed feelings that had clearly existed for years, feelings of love and longing, directed toward the very man Margaret was set to marry in less than 3 weeks. The letter spoke of old memories, of a winter snowstorm, and moments shared that Margaret had never fully understood the significance of pain and confusion regarding the current situation, and of genuine uncertainty about how to proceed, given the complicated tangle of loyalty, love, and duty, binding all three of them together. Margaret sat frozen, the letter clutched in trembling hands, as the full weight of understanding settled upon her. This explained everything: the subtle tension she had noticed between Eleanor and Alaric, the careful way they had both been behaving in recent weeks, the underlying current of something unspoken that had been troubling her intuition without her fully understanding its source. She heard Eleanor's footsteps returning down the hallway and quickly, guiltily, replaced the letter in its drawer, attempting to compose herself before her friend re-entered the room. But Eleanor, ever perceptive, immediately noticed something amiss in Margaret's expression. "Margaret, what is wrong?" she asked, concern evident in her voice as she took in her friend's pale complexion and trembling hands. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing, struggling to find words adequate to address what she had just discovered. Finally, she gestured toward the writing desk, toward the drawer where the letter remained hidden. "I saw the letter," she said quietly. "I know I should not have looked, but I saw enough to understand what it contains." Eleanor's face drained of color entirely, as understanding of what had happened settled upon her. "Margaret, I can explain."
Is it true?
Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and desperate need for clarity, rather than anger, at least in this initial moment of shock. "Do you love Alaric?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding an honesty that Eleanor had spent months carefully avoiding. She could have lied, could have attempted to explain away the letter as something less significant than what it actually represented. But looking at her dearest friend's face, at the genuine pain and confusion evident in her expression, Eleanor recognized that continued deception would only compound the betrayal already discovered. "Yes," she said quietly, tears beginning to form in her own eyes. "I have loved him for years, long before he began courting you. I discovered recently that he once felt the same way, that he wrote to me, expressing his intentions, but the letters never reached me, due to circumstances beyond either of our control. I have been struggling with this knowledge ever since, uncertain how to proceed without causing harm to you, whom I love as dearly as any sister." Margaret absorbed this explanation slowly, her mind racing through the implications of everything she was learning. "And Alaric? Does he still harbor these feelings for you?" "I do not know with certainty," Eleanor admitted honestly. "We have spoken briefly about the situation, acknowledging the truth of our shared history, but he has made no explicit declaration regarding his current feelings or intentions. He has expressed genuine care for you throughout our conversations, Margaret. I do not believe he wishes to cause you pain." "And yet," Margaret said, her voice growing sharper as the initial shock began transforming into something closer to hurt and anger, "you have both continued allowing me to proceed with wedding preparations, continued accepting my gratitude and trust, while harboring this significant secret between you. How long did you intend to continue this deception, Eleanor? Until after the wedding? Forever?" "I did not know how to tell you," Eleanor said, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "I did not want to cause you pain, did not want to disrupt your happiness, or damage our friendship. I have been genuinely torn, Margaret, uncertain what the right course of action might be, given the complicated nature of everything that has transpired." Margaret rose from her seat, pacing the length of the chamber as she attempted to process the magnitude of what she had learned. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice carrying a controlled calm that belied the turbulent emotions clearly churning beneath the surface. "I cannot continue this conversation right now, Eleanor. I need to leave, need space to consider everything you have just told me." "Margaret, please," Eleanor began, reaching toward her friend, desperate to somehow soften the pain her honesty had caused. "Please do not," Margaret said, stepping back from the outstretched hand, her composure finally cracking as tears began falling down her own cheeks. "I need time, Eleanor. I cannot process this while standing here with you. I need to think, and I cannot do that properly right now." She gathered her belongings hastily and departed, leaving Eleanor alone in her chamber, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily upon her as she processed the full magnitude of what had just occurred. The secret she had carried so carefully for weeks now stood fully exposed, and the consequences of that exposure remained entirely uncertain, threatening the very foundations of relationships she had spent years cultivating and cherishing. Margaret returned to her own family home in a state of profound emotional turmoil, retreating immediately to her chamber and refusing visitors for the remainder of the day, including a scheduled visit from Alaric himself, who had planned to discuss final arrangements for the wedding ceremony that evening. She spent hours alone with her thoughts, replaying every interaction she could remember between Eleanor and Alaric over the course of their courtship and engagement, searching for signs she had missed, moments of connection between them that she had failed to fully recognize or understand at the time. The realization that her two closest relationships, her dearest friend and her intended husband, harbored significant unspoken feelings for one another, cut deeply, threatening not only her upcoming marriage, but the very foundation of trust upon which her closest friendship had been built. She thought of confronting Alaric directly, of demanding he explain his own feelings and intentions given this revelation, but she also found herself, somewhat surprisingly, questioning her own feelings toward the impending marriage itself, wondering whether the comfortable companionship she shared with Alaric truly constituted the deep, passionate love she had always imagined would define her eventual marriage, or whether she had simply convinced herself of contentment because the match offered social advancement and genuine affection, even if it lacked the profound emotional depth apparently shared between Alaric and Eleanor. This question, once raised, proved impossible to fully set aside, forcing Margaret into deeper self-reflection than she had previously undertaken regarding her own feelings and expectations for the marriage, now less than 3 weeks away. She recognized, with growing clarity, that whatever decision she ultimately made regarding how to proceed would require careful consideration not only of the betrayal she had discovered, but of her own authentic desires and expectations for her future happiness, entirely separate from considerations of social obligation or previously established wedding plans. The night stretched long and sleepless as Margaret wrestled with these complicated questions, uncertain what path forward might ultimately provide the truest form of happiness for herself, while also considering the genuine care she still held for both Eleanor and Alaric, despite the pain their secret had caused her. 3 days passed before Margaret felt prepared to face either Eleanor or Alaric again, 3 days spent in careful reflection and quiet conversations with her own mother, who provided gentle guidance without attempting to influence her daughter's ultimate decision one way or another. During this period, Margaret arrived at a clarity of understanding regarding her own feelings that surprised even herself. She recognized, through careful honest reflection, that her affection for Alaric, while genuine, had never carried the depth of passion she suspected existed between him and Eleanor. She had been drawn to the security and comfort their match represented, to the genuine kindness he had shown her throughout their courtship, and to the excitement of a socially advantageous marriage that would elevate her family's standing considerably. But she had to admit, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that she had never experienced the kind of consuming, undeniable love that clearly existed between her fiancé and her dearest friend. This realization, rather than deepening her hurt, gradually transformed into something closer to clarity regarding the appropriate path forward. She requested a meeting with both Eleanor and Alaric together, arranging for them to gather in her family's private garden, away from the prying eyes and ears of servants or other family members who might overhear their difficult conversation. They arrived separately, both looking equally apprehensive about what the meeting might reveal. Margaret waited for them in the garden, seated on a bench beneath a large oak tree that had witnessed countless childhood games between herself and Eleanor over the years. "Thank you both for coming," Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of the conversation ahead. "I have spent the past several days considering everything that was revealed, and I believe I have arrived at some clarity regarding how we should proceed." Alaric and Eleanor exchanged nervous glances, neither entirely certain what Margaret intended to say, uncertain whether she intended to demand the wedding proceed regardless of the complicated feelings involved, or whether she planned something else entirely. "I care for you both deeply," Margaret continued. "You, Alaric, have been a source of genuine comfort and companionship throughout our courtship, and I do not regret the time we have spent together. And you, Eleanor, remain my dearest friend, someone whose friendship I value beyond almost anything else in my life." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "But I have come to recognize, through careful reflection these past days, that the love I feel for Alaric, while genuine, does not carry the depth and intensity that clearly exists between the two of you. I would be doing us all a disservice, proceeding with a marriage built on comfortable companionship while knowing that deeper, truer feelings exist elsewhere." "Margaret," Alaric began, his voice carrying genuine concern, "I do care for you deeply. I would not wish to cause you pain by ending our engagement, if that is not truly what you desire." "I appreciate your concern," Margaret said, offering a small, genuine smile despite the difficulty of the conversation. "But I have thought carefully about this, Alaric, and I believe ending our engagement represents the right decision, not only for your sake and Eleanor's, but for my own sake as well. I deserve a marriage built on the kind of deep, passionate love that clearly exists between you two, rather than settling for comfortable companionship that, while pleasant, does not represent the fullest expression of what marriage could offer." Eleanor listened to this exchange with a mixture of relief and continued concern for her friend's well-being. "Margaret, are you certain this is truly what you want? I do not wish for you to make such a significant decision based solely on consideration for our feelings, at the expense of your own happiness." "I am certain," Margaret said firmly. "This decision is entirely my own, made after careful reflection on what I truly desire for my future. I do not wish to spend my life wondering whether I settled for something less than what I deserved, simply because ending an engagement felt socially difficult or embarrassing to navigate. She turned to face both of them directly, her expression carrying genuine warmth despite the emotional complexity of the moment. I release you both from any obligation to consider my feelings in determining how you wish to proceed. If you love each other, as it seems clear you do, I would rather see you find happiness together than watch you both suppress genuine feelings out of misguided loyalty to me. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she processed the magnitude of Margaret's generosity and understanding. I do not know how to thank you for such grace, Margaret. I never wished to cause you pain, and I am deeply sorry for the hurt this situation has caused you, regardless of how it ultimately resolves. I know you never intended to hurt me, Margaret said gently, and I recognize that circumstances beyond either of your control kept you apart for years, circumstances neither of you could have anticipated or controlled. I do not hold either of you responsible for feelings that existed before my own relationship with Alaric began. The three of them sat together for a long while, discussing the practical implications of Margaret's decision, the difficult conversations that would need to occur with both families, the social complications that would inevitably arise from canceling a wedding so close to its scheduled date. But beneath these practical concerns existed a growing sense of relief, a lifting of the weight that had pressed heavily upon all three of them throughout the preceding weeks of secrecy and uncertainty. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked Margaret, as their conversation began winding toward its natural conclusion. "I worry about the position this puts you in, socially and personally." Margaret considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "I believe I shall take some time for myself, perhaps travel to visit my aunt in the northern counties, away from the immediate social complications that will surely arise from this decision. I have always wanted to see more of the world beyond our immediate social circle, and this seems as good a time as any to pursue that desire." "And when you return?" Alaric asked, genuine concern evident in his voice. "When I return," Margaret said, a small smile beginning to form despite the difficulty of recent days, "I hope to find myself, and perhaps discover what I truly desire from life, unencumbered by social expectations or pressure to secure a particular kind of match. I am young still, and I believe there is wisdom in taking time to understand myself more fully before committing to marriage with anyone." This response brought a measure of comfort to both Eleanor and Alaric, recognizing that Margaret's decision stemmed not from despair or resignation, but from genuine self-reflection and a desire to pursue authentic happiness on her own terms, rather than settling for a comfortable but ultimately unfulfilling match. As the meeting drew to its conclusion, Margaret rose from the bench and embraced Eleanor warmly, the physical gesture conveying forgiveness and continued affection despite the difficult circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "I do not wish for this situation to damage our friendship permanently," she said softly. "You remain my dearest friend, Eleanor, regardless of how complicated recent weeks have proven." "And you shall always remain mine," Eleanor replied, tears falling freely now as she embraced her friend with genuine gratitude and continued affection. Margaret then turned to Alaric, offering a more formal but equally warm farewell. "I wish you genuine happiness, Alaric. I believe you shall find it with Eleanor, in ways that our own match, however pleasant, could never have provided." "Thank you, Margaret," Alaric said, his voice carrying deep sincerity. "Your grace and understanding throughout this difficult situation speaks to the truly remarkable character I always recognized in you, even if our paths were not meant to converge permanently as husband and wife." With these words, Margaret departed the garden, leaving Eleanor and Alaric alone together for the first time since the truth of their feelings had been fully acknowledged and accepted by all three parties involved in this complicated tangle of love, loyalty, and friendship. Alaric and Eleanor remained standing in the quiet garden long after Margaret's departure, the weight of everything that had transpired settling slowly upon them as they began to comprehend the possibilities now open before them, possibilities that had seemed impossibly distant only days earlier. "I can hardly believe this is real," Eleanor said softly, still processing the remarkable grace Margaret had shown throughout their difficult conversation. "After everything, after years of believing this future could never exist for us, here we stand, free to acknowledge feelings we spent so long suppressing." Margaret's generosity exceeds anything I could have hoped for, Alaric agreed, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and continued disbelief at how the situation had ultimately resolved itself. I only hope she finds the genuine happiness she deserves, wherever her travels and future decisions might lead her. They stood together beneath the ancient oak tree, the afternoon sunlight filtering through its branches, casting gentle patterns of light and shadow across the garden path. For the first time since their conversation in this same estate's ballroom weeks earlier, when Alaric had first announced his engagement to Margaret, they found themselves able to speak openly, without the weight of secrecy and guilt hanging over every word exchanged between them. "I owe you an explanation," Alaric said finally, turning to face Eleanor directly. "For years of silence, for allowing circumstances and assumptions to keep us apart, when perhaps, had I been braver, had I pursued the matter more directly, after receiving no response to my letters, we might have found our way to each other far sooner than this." "We cannot change the past," Eleanor said gently, "though I understand the impulse to wish we had acted differently. My mother's intervention, however well-intentioned, created circumstances neither of us could have anticipated or easily overcome. We were both young, uncertain, and operating under false assumptions about the other's feelings. I do not believe either of us bears sole responsibility for the years we spent apart." "You are gracious to say so," Alaric replied, reaching for her hand with a tenderness he had rarely allowed himself to express so openly. "But I intend to spend considerable effort ensuring that no further misunderstandings or unspoken assumptions come between us going forward. Should you be willing to consider a future together, now that circumstances have finally aligned in our favor?" Eleanor felt her heart swell with an emotion she had suppressed for so long, that its sudden, full expression felt almost overwhelming in its intensity. "I have wanted this for years, Alaric, longer than I dared admit even to myself. I would be honored to consider whatever future we might build together, now that we are finally free to pursue it honestly and openly." He drew her closer, and for the first time in their long history of careful friendship and suppressed feeling, he leaned forward and kissed her gently, a kiss that carried within it years of accumulated longing, finally given permission to express itself fully. Eleanor returned the kiss with equal tenderness, tears of genuine joy now mixing with the earlier tears of complicated emotion that had marked this transformative afternoon. When they finally separated, both were smiling, a lightness settling over them that neither had experienced in longer than they could easily remember. "We shall need to proceed carefully," Eleanor said, practical considerations beginning to reassert themselves even amid the joy of this newfound freedom. "Society will surely have opinions regarding a broken engagement, followed quickly by a new match between the groom and the former bride's closest friend." "Let them have their opinions," Alaric said, a rare note of defiance entering his voice. "I have spent my entire adult life carefully managing expectations, considering social propriety above my own genuine happiness. I do not intend to make that same mistake again, now that I finally understand what true happiness might look like, should I have the courage to pursue it fully." They spent the remainder of that afternoon walking through the garden, discussing practical matters that would need to be addressed in the coming weeks. Announcements would need to be made, explaining the end of the engagement between Alaric and Margaret in terms that protected everyone's dignity, while remaining truthful about the fundamental incompatibility that had led to the decision. A period of respectful distance would likely be wise before any new engagement between Alaric and Eleanor could be announced, allowing sufficient time to pass that their new match would not appear scandalously hasty in the eyes of their social circle. But beneath these practical considerations existed a foundation of genuine happiness and hope that neither of them had experienced in longer than they could remember, a sense that after years of careful restraint and suppressed feeling, they had finally found their way to the future they had both quietly hoped for since childhood. Word of the broken engagement spread quickly through their social circle in the days that followed, generating considerable speculation and gossip, much of it inaccurate, regarding the true circumstances that had led to the decision. But Margaret, true to the grace she had shown throughout the entire situation, made clear in her own careful communications that the decision had been mutual and amicable, that she held no ill will toward either Alaric or Eleanor, and that she looked forward to her upcoming travels with genuine excitement, rather than the despair many had assumed would accompany such a significant disappointment. She departed for her aunt's estate in the northern counties within the fortnight, writing warm, genuine letters to Eleanor throughout her travels, describing new experiences and observations with the same enthusiasm she had once reserved for wedding preparations. Her letters carried no trace of lingering bitterness or resentment, instead reflecting genuine growth and self-discovery as she embraced this unexpected new chapter of her life with characteristic openness and courage. Eleanor and Alaric, meanwhile, allowed their relationship to develop with careful deliberation, honoring the respectful distance that propriety demanded, while also finally permitting themselves the open expression of feelings they had suppressed for so many years. They spent long afternoons together, much as they had during their years of careful friendship, but now free from the constraints of secrecy and unspoken longing that had previously colored every interaction between them. 6 months after Margaret's departure for the northern counties, Alaric formally proposed to Eleanor in the same rose garden where he had once, as a boy of 14, offered her a single wilted flower. This time, the roses bloomed in full, vibrant color around them, a fitting symbol for the flourishing love that had finally been given permission to bloom after years of careful restraint. Eleanor accepted his proposal with tears of genuine joy, understanding fully the remarkable journey that had led them to this moment, a journey marked by years of quiet longing, painful uncertainty, and ultimately, the profound generosity of a friend whose grace had made their happiness possible. Their wedding, when it finally occurred the following spring, carried a joy and authenticity that reflected the genuine love finally being celebrated between them. Margaret returned from her travels to attend the ceremony, standing proudly beside Eleanor as her closest friend and bridesmaid, having found her own sense of peace and purpose during her months of travel and self-discovery. She had, during her time away, met a gentleman scholar with whom she had formed a genuine connection, built on shared intellectual curiosity and mutual respect, a match that felt far more authentic to her own true desires than her previous engagement ever had. Watching Eleanor and Alaric exchange their vows, surrounded by the same rose garden that had witnessed the beginning of their long, complicated journey toward each other, Margaret felt only genuine happiness for her dearest friends, understanding fully that everything had unfolded exactly as it should have, regardless of the painful complications that had marked the path toward this joyful conclusion. As Eleanor and Alaric shared their first dance as husband and wife beneath the same ancient oak tree where they had first acknowledged their feelings freely, Eleanor caught her friend's eye across the celebrating crowd and offered a warm, grateful smile, silently thanking Margaret once more for the remarkable grace and generosity that had made this moment of profound happiness finally possible. The years that followed brought Eleanor and Alaric a marriage built on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and the deep, abiding love that had weathered years of separation and uncertainty before finally finding its way to fulfillment. Margaret, too, found lasting happiness with her scholar husband, and the friendship between the two women remained strong throughout the years, tested by extraordinary circumstances, but ultimately strengthened by the honesty, grace, and genuine care that had guided each of them through one of the most complicated periods of their intertwined lives. Looking back on the evening when Alaric had first announced his engagement over dinner, and Eleanor had responded with nothing more than a request to pass the salt, both would later reflect on how that moment of carefully maintained composure had marked the beginning of a journey none of them could have anticipated, a journey that ultimately led each of them toward the authentic happiness they had all, in their own ways, deserved to find.